about mini satins. She has some amazing rabbits, some gorgeous colors that appeal to me very much because they look like jewelry. So, so she is going to come talk to us a little bit about those, and she is very patient with me and indulges all my little quotes and questions about her breed. I even asked her when she got back there, I said, did you bring a black twort? And she goes, no,
No twarts today.
not today. She didn't.
Blue twort at home, but her coat
At the
trashed out on
moment.
me, so
Gotcha.
she stayed at home.
Do you remember the precious metals picture? Do you remember
I
that
do. I
picture?
actually have it.
Oh,
I
yay.
set my stuff down. Here it goes.
Got it.
I put things down. Well, thank you, Stacy, for inviting me to present. I do raise many satins. Satins were my home for almost 30 years. But in the midst of that, especially toward the tail end, I started raising mini satins. And then several years ago, we shifted from satins just to mini satins. So we have a barn full of mini satins in color, which is fun. I never thought I'd say that, but I did. So, I mean, the basics on it, but still reminding of weights. So for seniors, you have a maximum weight of 4 3/4 pounds. Please don't be afraid to put seniors on the scale, both in the minimum and the maximum. We are seeing some mini satins with insufficient bone, and they're just small, very small. And it's very easy to see mini satins go over that 4 3/4. So don't be afraid to put them on the scale. With the last standard revision, the junior weight did go from 3 3/4 to 4 pounds. So please make sure that you are aware of that. That 4 pound or that 1/4 pound increase to 4 pounds allows the breed to have more competitive juniors on the table. We were finding that we were having a lot of unfinished juniors because to keep them under 3 3/4, they were younger. So it allowed more mature animals to go into junior class before they were 6 months old. And it allowed finish without having to show as a senior. So as a breeder, we appreciate it. And if they're a junior that exceeds junior weight, they may show in a senior. Looking at points, and I did add a note, we're talking about breed character and tying that back in. Many satins aren't just small satins. There are breed differences when it comes to weight, or to the point breakdown. If you look at satins, and the red is the satin standard broken down. If you look at points, for general type, you have 45 points. If you take fur and color and put that together for the coat, that's also 40 points. If you split 45 points. If you split condition, you have a 50-50 animal. So 50 points or 50% of the animal is the type, 50% is the coat. If you look at mini satins, that's not the case. For type, you have 55 points. Coming down under coat, you have 35 points. So it does shift the emphasis. Another place that the points the emphasis changes is on head and ears. There is more points on the head and ear on a mini satin than there is on the satin. So you do want to make sure that you are maintaining that dwarf breed character with that head and ear, a big thick ear, or thicker ear, well-furred ear, and a thicker head. A lot of this is going to echo what I've seen in other presentations. I walked in about midway on Mikey's, but echoing some of the comments that have been made by several presentations on type. It is a dwarf breed, so short, close couple, deep animal with sufficient width. But one thing I do want to point out that I see pretty often in a breed as a battle is top line, because building that proper top line builds a proper animal. With a proper top line comes proper muscling and placement of muscling. I know these aren't mini satins, but this is one of the best illustrations in the standard, and both of those are from the current standard. If you look in the color portion, at the front of the standard, that's the Californian. If you look under the breed, that's the Californian. And you have a rabbit that peaks entirely too early, and a rabbit that's much more correct, still a little forward, but much more correct in its high point. So taking that to mini satins, that's a chocolate mini satin that peaks way too early. That's a broken black mini satin that's much more correct in its high point. But they are to peak over the center of the hip, not the forward placement of the hip like the Palominos with Mikey's presentation, but the center of the hip. When you get that correct high point, you have sufficient loin muscling that will carry that fullness back. Rabbits that peak early tend to narrow channel and shallow over that loin, and they'll also tend to have a loin that tapers into that hindquarter. When you can push that high point back to where it needs to be, you get enough loin muscling that flanks it, and it carries a wider, fuller, smoother rabbit through the hindquarter. Head and ears on mini satins, you have more points there. You want a round, well-developed head. it really does showcase it. It is a dwarf breed, so that is breed character. When you see very long, snipey heads with long ears, that's your non-dwarf. Oh, and it does have an ear length disqualification, 3.5 inches. And I meant to grab one on the way out, but I, of course, forgot something. That might be the one thing. I haven't figured the other yet. But the cage tags that have, they're the small rectangular cage tags that you can hang, those are actually 3.5 inches. So I have one of those that sits on my grooming table, my work table, and that's what I measure ears with. Do not be afraid to put a ruler between the ears and measure ears. There's a lot of mini satins across the table that are sitting an 1/8 inch to 1/4 of an inch over, but it's deceptive. When you have a rabbit that has depth of body, it's easy to lose the length of ear perspective. So there'll be rabbits that are over an ear length, but because they're such a deep body, it proportionally looks like it should fit the animal. It is a dwarf breed, and the dwarf gene is an important thing to point out. Stacy talked about a jeweled litter. This was that litter when it got older. I have the baby picture. It's a lot cuter. And that is a litter that I produced in my barn, and that was one litter. But one thing I want to point out is that it is a dwarf gene, and the reason I put that picture up there is you can pick your dwarfs and your non-dwarfs in that litter. When a rabbit gets 2 copies of that dwarf gene, it's a peanut and it's fatal. They don't live, or at least they shouldn't. But they have to have one copy or one of that dwarf gene to show those breed characteristics. So you want them to have a dwarf gene. You want them to have the shorter, deeper, wider, rounder head, and it brings about that shorter ear. Without that dwarf gene, you have a non-dwarf or a false dwarf, and those are the normal-looking rabbits. Longer ears, snipier head, 5.5 to 6 pound animals. I'm not saying those aren't useful in a breeding program, but they really shouldn't be on the show table. I see lots of them as juniors on the show table, not necessarily at breed national shows, but at local shows. They'll show as juniors, but never make it to the seniors because they'll be overweight and the ears are too long. If you look through that, though, you can see the length of ear on this black tort at the top. And if you compare that length of ear to this sepia Siamese or this chocolate tort, you can see the difference in ear length. This little guy was a chocolate Siamese, and he was also a non-dwarf. So you have 3, if you can look at the length of body, it gives you some hints as well, that had the dwarf gene, and then 2 on either end that were longer in ear. Coming out of the nest box, it's hard to spot them. You give them a couple of weeks until they grow, and then you see the difference, and they're easy to pick out and pull out. They just have to hit a certain point in growth. The fur description, it's a very fine, soft, silky coat. You want as soft as possible. There's really not such thing as too soft of a coat. So be very careful in your descriptors on this coat structure. Be very thoughtful in your comments, and that's my bottom line on that. Is if I have a judge who says things about my animals like it's too soft in coat, that's not possible. It's not. Use a different descriptor. It's a cottony coat. There's too much undercoat without the guard hair to support it. It's an immature coat. Young coats are very cottony. Cottony is a very different descriptor, or that description talking about the amount of undercoat is a very different descriptor than talking about an overly soft coat. So you lose some credit with satin breeders as a judge when you start talking about overly soft coats, because that's not possible. There should be a guard hair to support the coat. It's the guard hair that gives the coat the sheen. What's I guess the trick of it is to have the fine diameter guard hair that gives you that beautiful satin texture. You lose some of that shininess. When you see a really, really heavily sheened animal, they have a really heavy guard hair. They're going to usually have a much coarser texture. So the diameter of the guard hair is what gives that sheen because of the satin coat structure, but it also lends toward a harsher coat. They also usually, those really heavily sheened animals usually have a longer guard hair, a guard hair that stands a lot higher above the undercoat, which also lends toward a coarser coat. It does talk about a uniform length. You tend to see that a lot more in dilutes, but nonetheless, you want a uniform length, and again, that also lends toward that proper texture. DQ for absence of sheen. One thing I will add on coat structure, though, is it's not a rollback, it's not a flyback. Neither satins nor mini satins stipulate that it's a flyback or a rollback coat. And there are numerous times over showing satins and mini satins, and I've had judges comment that it's not the correct flyback coat, or it's a good flyback coat, or a good rollback coat. And a lot of breeders will stand around with a quirked eyebrow thinking, they're making things up. So that's another one of know your vocabulary when it comes to the breed and choose your thoughts carefully. There's 16 variety groups within mini satins now, and there's really nothing new on the horizon at this point. Or there's projects, but nothing that's immediately going to be presented to the standards committee, which is new. That's the first in a while that we really haven't had a whole lot going on with presentations. But that being said, with 16 varieties, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time detailing what a black looks like because that's fairly standard. But I do want to point out within the varieties some specifics, peculiarities, and things to watch for. So blacks. I mean, it's a fairly standard black description. Some things that I would suggest you watch for: marbled eye color. It runs rampant. And blue-gray eye color. Not as often, but you do see marbled eye color. There's enough other varieties, especially when you've got chins who allow the whole world in eye color almost, that marbled eye tends to come into play. Siamese backgrounds also give blacks marbled eyes sometimes. Blues, and remember with the sheen, with that the guard hair of a satin coat, and with sheen you have a much more rich and intense color. So blues are very deep in color. Watch for a poor or white undercolor, but also watch for mismatched toenails. You usually don't see anything crazy in eye color. In blues, it's usually toenails. Brokens, any variety in conjunction with white. It does stipulate that it has to have, or there has to be color around the eyes, the ears, the nose, basically your facial markings. Doesn't disqualify from mismatched toenails. It does disqualify for less than 10%, but not disqualifying for over 50. So we don't mind heavy patterns in the mini satin crowd, or the satin crowd for that matter. Do watch for excessive scattered white hairs. Steels exist. Silvertip steels exist. So you'll get a rabbit that looks like a broken, but it's steeled in its pattern. Lots of scattered white hairs in its broken pattern. And that's where you're looking for steels. Also, and I didn't necessarily mention this, but there's broken pointed white or broken Himalayan animals exist. So if you get an animal that looks like it doesn't have any color on the back, be a little wary of that too. Chinchilla. A couple of things to point out is with the last standard, the eye color expectations changed as well. So anything but pink flies. So you can have brown, you can have blue-gray, and you can have marbled eye color within the chinchillas. That's satins and mini satins now. The DQs for the extremes in color: extremely dark, extremely light, the brown tinge, the brassiness, but do not, there's a peculiar disqualification, or not peculiar, but specific disqualification of not disqualifying for, or do not disqualify for absence of blue undercolor on any portion of the tail. Well, that was interesting and false. Chocolate, and that is a chocolate animal. Just remember with sheen, it makes it dark. So you have really deep, rich color. Guys do not have to have a ruby cast. It calls for brown with ruby cast, but it's not a disqualification if it's not present or if you don't see it. You have three agouti varieties. You have the copper, which is comparable to your chestnut agouti. You have a chocolate agouti, and you have your opal, which is your blue. I basically gave your three of them in comparison through the next couple of slides. So there's your black, there's your chocolate, and there's your blue. And if you look at the descriptions of them, they're all very similar in wordings. It just changes the color descriptors a bit. So you go from the undercolor of chocolate, with slate blue, with copper of slate blue, chocolate of the dove gray, opal of slate blue. So the wording of the three standards are very, very similar. It just changes the color intensities throughout. Orange versus fawn, the black, the chocolate, the blue. So I really in this wanted to point out that the verbiage is very similar. It just changes slightly when it turns to the intensity based on the three varieties. And I will give full credit to Melissa McGee. I hope she's watching. There was a conversation at one point whenever the chocolate agoutis were coming out of how do you tell the difference? How do you tell the difference between a chocolate agouti and a copper? Or for instance with Rex, how do you tell the difference between an amber and a castor? And Melissa McGee and I in conversation, she's mentioned this and it's really stuck with me. You look at the top of the tail. The top of the tail is brown, you have a chocolate-based animal. If it's black, you have a black-based animal. So if you're trying to tell whether you have an amber versus a castor or a chocolate agouti versus a copper, look at the top of the tail. Sometimes you can really see it on the lacing of the ears, but the top of the tail is a really, really easy, good place to check in on. And that just runs through the rest of it. Disqualifications for copper, it's your extremes in colors, kind of like your chinchillas. For your chocolate goodie and your opal, it's the absence of ring color. And then for coppers, it's not a disqualification for absence of blue undercolor on the pail. Himalayans, and I happened to glance over and see Mike over there. I almost felt like you should come do this portion of it because he's very instrumental in bringing this to our club. It's shown as a group, black, blue, chocolate, and lilac. It's all of your point color. Be aware that the toenails can be light or dark as long as they match. So if you have dark, light, dark, dark, that would be a mismatched toenail situation. But if they're all uniformly lighter showing pigment, that's perfectly acceptable. It just needs to show pigment. With any pointed white animal, Californians, Himalayans, watch for white or mismatched toenails and smut. Mike, do you see smut very often on them?
I've had one rabbit in 5 years, and that was somewhere in the pretty low.
I was thinking as I was writing that in there that I don't see very many of them. I don't know that I've seen but maybe one or two on the show table ever with it.
I agree.
Otters is another shown in groups, black, blue, chocolate, and lilac. It's pretty consistent with a lot of other breeds when you're talking about otters. Blacks and chocolates will have orange markings, blue and lilac will have fawn markings. Belly and nostrils, it's very consistent with the rest, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. I've seen one instance of marbled eye on a black otter, but I haven't really noticed a whole lot either in raising or in judging otters with odd eye colors. Reds, a very even color, flame red orange, running deep down toward the skin. You want that color to run as close to the skin as you can down the hair shaft. Again, it goes to intensity. You will have smutty reds, but very clean reds are incredibly possible. And those are two incredibly clean reds. I do want to point out one thing on it, though. Look at the length of ear and head on this one. You have a rounder head and a shorter, thicker ear. Look at the length of ear on that one. So that one is probably your non-dwarf. You can kind of spot them as you go. The toenails are to show color. Again, you would disqualify for mismatch, fault for ticking, fault for a little smuttiness. But as a red variety, it's not uncommon. But clean is out there. Siamese is another group. I would love to say black, blue, chocolate, lilac, but if you look at the wording of the standard, it's actually sepia, not black. So it's a sepia animal, a blue, a chocolate, and a lilac. So it's not a true black, it's just a really deep dark brown with a sepia. Things to watch for, or things to know that they do appear in blue and lilac. They're just not as common on the table. Watch for marbled eyes, especially on the sepias. It runs rampant. It's horrible and very hard to get rid of. I raise them and it's miserable. Things to know from, the judge's perspective, but it ties back to the breeder's perspective. There is a very direct correlation to texture and the depth of color. An animal that is going to be a little bit lighter across the saddle with a little bit cleaner shadings to there, but that lighter saddle color will lend toward a cleaner texture, a more proper texture. The darker the shading, the coarser the texture, almost every time. So for the deeper, darker, richer, almost kind of that yellowy, deep peanut butter with the heavier shadings, those animals usually have a much harsher texture than the ones who are lighter. I don't breed for color, it's my Siamese, I breed for texture. So when I walk through the barn, I look for anything that was going to be a darker animal, and I have one, and it's an older brood doe, and she's just gotten smuttier as the years have gone on, and she's molted several times. But the majority of my, like I said, I don't breed for color, I don't really cull for color that way, they just all lend in that direction because I cull hard for texture on coat. One thing that I do want to point out is the different colors other than sepia, they aren't necessarily rare, I would say, but they aren't super common. This is one that I did produce, and I really wish that before I got rid of or sold him, that I got better pictures of him. He was a lilac Siamese, but he was a lilac Siamese with a whole lot of depth of color. So when he went to our breed nationals, not this year, but the year before, and it was quite a conversation down there. And then when the Siamese were on the table, several people were asking, what color is that rabbit? Because they thought he was a tort. He was, in fact, a lilac Siamese. So because I'm judging, and Mom often puts the rabbits on the tables, and I make sure she is well-versed on what color he is for people who ask, but also so that if a judge decides to disqualify him, that she'll have words to back herself up on it. But do know that they do exist. They just look a little goofy, I suppose. He was actually a beautiful animal. He just didn't fit with what I needed for my breeding program, so he lives with somebody else now. But they do exist. They're just not super, super common out there. Light or dark toenails are permitted. On your darker shaded animals, you'll usually see darker toenails. On the lighter animals, such as this one, you're going to see a lighter toenail color. As long as they match, you're good to go. You can have darker on the hind and lighter on the rear. It's not saying that all 4 feet have to match. It's the same foot and corresponding foot. So if you have light, light, and dark, dark, that's totally permissible. Again, watch for marbled eye color. It runs rampant in the Siamese. Silver martins are again grouped black, blue, chocolate, and lilac. Nothing really all that special about that one in comparison to other breeds that have that variety. Again, watch for mismatched toenails or incorrect eye color. Squirrels are a newer variety. It's a blue chinchilla. So if you take the chin standard, basically convert it over to blue, they read very similarly. Absence of ring color and brown patches are going to be disqualifications. What I find in the squirrel, especially because you have a guard hair that approximates the length of the undercoat, is that the surface tends to be fairly uniform in color, but they do have that ring color in there. They're quite striking, very pretty animals. Torts are also shown as a group, black, blue, chocolate, and lilac. Those you'll see the different shadings of them besides black more often in torts than you do in Siamese. I raise torts as well, and I don't really get funny eye colors in them very often, so I didn't really even mention it here. Whites, it's a white animal. Red eyes, pink eyes. But it kind of runs back to a few comments on knowing the vernacular of the breed or really knowing how to sound smart as a judge. So I always kind of end my presentation on either satins or mini satins with this, and it's talking about breed specific or breed relevant comments, also known as how to make yourself sound smart as a judge. This is that same litter that I pointed out earlier. Oh, I just realized that the colors are reversed top to bottom. So kind of running through the colors on it, it's a black tort, that's a blue tort, and a chocolate tort. That's a sepia Siamese, just a lighter one, and that's a chocolate Siamese. And you can see the difference between tort and Siamese on that. You can also start seeing, like with this little guy, he ended up being one of my little non-dwarfs. Look how long his ears are. So you can start seeing that more, the older they get in their nest box. That was one doe. She produced skittle litters every single time. It was kind of fascinating for me. She's a very consistent producer, makes pretty animals too. Sheen. In the vein of how to sound smart as a judge when it comes to satin breeds, please don't comment heavily on sheen. Please don't tell me I need to work on sheen. It's either there or it's not. Disqualify it for not absence of sheen, but when you start praising sheen, you are typically praising a harsher coat. If you are telling me to go home and work on sheen, you're telling me to go home and work on something that I don't work on. Mike, do you ever breed for sheen? No. Satin breeders don't. It's either there or it's not. And so it's one of those things that from the satin breeder perspective, when we have judges who start harping on sheen and going crazy talking about so much beautiful sheen or lack of sheen, it's really just kind of showing a little bit of a naive attitude toward the guard hair and the coat structure. Color saturation, know that with the sheen and with the satin coat, color saturation is intense. So you have things like torts that are really, really deep and rich, and that's because of sheen. So make sure you know the difference. Make sure you can tell the difference between a blue tort and a blue Siamese, between a lilac tort and a lilac Siamese. It makes you sound very knowledgeable as a judge. Texture, again, don't ever tell me that my coat is too soft. It's meant to be. Find other words and vocabulary to describe it. It doesn't hurt my feelings if you talk about a junior coat being a little cottony, because if there's a lot of undercoat without the developed guard hair, that one's not necessarily an offensive, but if you start saying that my coat is too soft, that's kind of a slap in the face. In return of coat, don't harp on a flyback or a rollback because our breed standard doesn't say it. And those are some things that tend to be, I guess, I don't want to say things that stick for satin breeders, but those are things that from the satin breeder perspective or mini satin breeder perspective, that gives you some credibility as a judge toward the breeders if you kind of stick with the vernacular of the breed. And I think that goes with any breed. Knowing the specific breed relevant comments make you sound smart as a judge as well. I did at the break, if you want, I did bring a couple of animals if you want to look at some differences in coat structure and feel some texture.
I want to.
I'm happy to put them up for a little bit of a show and tell, touch and feel, something of that nature. Questions? Mike, anything you want to add?
What I tell people, especially new judges on fur, is you want it as soft and as dense as you can get to the still fur. You just don't want it to stand there like that.
Yes. And what I also tell people is, I mean, when I stroke a coat, basically you let the coat run through your hand. I want it to, it's like air. It's like a whisper of air on my hand. I don't want to feel it at all, really. That's a really proper texture. When you can feel it, that's when you're creeping toward harsh. So you want it to just, I mean, literally be like a whisper along your hand. If you're really having to dig in and feel it, it's really lending toward harsh.
Are the varieties and their corresponding to texture similar with satins? So there are certain varieties that are generally softer or more correct in texture than others?
Like blues versus blacks, your dilutes typically have a much cleaner texture, tend to lend toward that proper texture. Your like blues versus blacks, even within torts, I've noticed that my dilute torts have a cleaner texture. But some of it is also the bloodlines that made it up and the length of that guard hair. With whites, you have very like polar ends of it. You have that heavier guard hair, a little harsher coat, a lot of sheen, and you have that more refined guard hair and that softer coat.
Which
So,
varieties struggle most with texture?
your goodies. I mean, I really, especially coppers, I think. I think chocolates and I think your chocolated goodies are a little bit better. But I think that just kind of lends toward it. And but I'll also add some of your varieties that aren't as frequently worked on. You don't have as many people breeding them like reds. It just doesn't have the pool of breeders underneath it, so it doesn't have quite the gene pool, and it doesn't have quite the focus from the widespread medium.
Thank you.
So, any others?
Thank you.
Sure thing.